Oh, wait. You know, it's like a galaxy. Welcome, everybody. Feel free to continue eating your lunch and feel free to get dessert after you finish your lunch. But we're running a little late, so I did want to introduce John in case people had things they need to go to after this. It's great to have John Melton here, head of Lake Forest Country Day School. And I thought at first I'd just share a tie between Onwencia and the day school that few people know about. Back when this land was purchased in 1895, the Lake Forest Club, the precursor to Onwencia, was at the day school. It was on the same land, and there was a 9-hole golf course there. And it didn't have hazards like sand traps or the Skokie ditch like we have today, but its main hazard was sheep. And these sheep would go and nibble on errant shots. And it didn't have, nice locker rooms like we have today. The locker room was the sheep shed. So it wasn't, things have improved a lot since then. John, as many of you know, has an East Coast background, mainly in Virginia and Maryland, and that's where he's been involved with independent education. So I asked him, why the Midwest? What made you want to be out here and what makes you want to stay here? And his answer was the same for both the students. And he said the group of students he had lunch with when he had his finalist visit were so welcoming and nice, and that the students he's met since he's been here since 2022, he's just been really impressed how respectful they are of each other, how kind they are to each other, and they're just a very impressive group. So, John, as you know, many of us are alums of LFCDS, and we're excited to hear what you have to say about our alma mater. And so, take it away.
Thank you, David. So I want to start out by thanking David and for inviting me, and Mimi Murley had a hand in it as well. And I want to thank Julie for arranging everything, and I want to thank all the staff at Onwencia for a wonderful lunch. It's a little intimidating to be asked to come speak to a group of individuals about the school that you represent, or you've represented for a year and a half, when most of them have a very, very long multi-generational history with the school. But I'm going to do my best. And I was asked a couple of times today during lunch, how are you acclimating to the weather in Lake Forest and the Chicago area? And my glass is half full. Puxatawny Phil did not see his shadow this morning. So I think we're going to have an abbreviated winter and move into spring pretty quickly. So I'd like to start by just engaging with you a little bit and learning a little bit about the audience and ask you to take a minute to think about a time during your K-8 experience when you felt like you were really learning. It was such a memorable moment, and there was something that came through or broke through or some concept that revealed itself to you during that time that still sticks with you. And why? What about that moment made the learning so accessible to you? So I'm going to ask you to talk with the members, maybe to the person next to you or the people at your table. And fair warning, as a teacher, I need to tell you, I am going to ask you to share. I'll ask you to volunteer to share, but just take a couple of minutes. Again, the topic is a moment you experienced during your K-8 time when you really felt like you were learning, and why? What about that moment made it special? So I'll stop there and let you guys chat with one another. No.
Right. So and then you go out. Right.
Yeah, it's teaching, it's taking you out. Street fighting, so the only change happened. I'm a rich kid from Tennessee, 36. Yeah, please. Yeah, what's really just particular you guys are right. You're at the floor. Who's praying? Oh, yeah. There you go.
All right, and we're back. Do I have anybody that'd like to volunteer the experience? Maybe you can volunteer somebody else's experience. It's okay as well. Volunteers about learning moments that were impactful. Yes. So Deanna, what have we're in common? It was a play for her, and it was repertory theater. A play and repertory theater. Great. Other experiences.
We shared the same influential teacher at the day school, Frank Ward. He was, a coach to all, no matter your ability. And I particularly remember the Saturday hikes that he would take us through on meetings with fathers and mothers who wanted to help out. And that was impactful because he was giving them this private time to do something he's normally do.
Yeah. A special teacher who invested their time and themselves in you, so that you know that they knew you. And they cared about you. Yeah. Other examples? Yes.
It was a teacher at the day school again, Eddie Connors. He taught history in seventh grade and medieval Europe, some of it. And he had this passion about talking about the architecture of churches and the lives that people led. And he made it so much fun. I mean, it was something I can still hear about the board.
Okay, so the passion and enthusiasm inspiring teacher.
I had a history teacher in eighth grade. I did get past eighth grade. And she, this was in a public junior high, seventh, eighth, and ninth, and she had been to Europe. And she was teaching American world history, and so everywhere she'd been, everywhere she taught, she'd been, and she had these amazing slides. And she told us about the Annisquam Dam, this was before it was built. And all these beautiful artifacts and buildings by the Egyptians were going to be flooded. I was so horrified. And when we went to Egypt years later, down at the bottom, I remember there's still some remaining, but the dam was built right before the city went flooded. It was a big deal. Of course, you all don't know that probably the asphalt had flooded all this, but you're as old as I am, you do know.
So what I'm hearing in your answers, and I ask this question a lot, and this is actually a question that we included in our focus groups in a recent strategic design process we've engaged in. But this is a question I get frequently, and it's very, very common for the responses to center around a specific teacher, an event, the performing arts, athletics, and strangely, it very rarely has to do with that great math test I had, or something that happened in the classroom. It's about the relationships and the experiences that we have in that environment. And I think that's a really good segue into talking about Lake Forest Country Day School, because that's something that is paramount to us. And not only is it a priority for us in terms of how we operate, but in this recent strategic design effort we've been involved in, it's something that's been reflected back to us. It's something that we do well, and we should always strive to do even better. So I thought I'd start us out. Some of you may not have been on campus recently, so we have a little 5-minute, it's about a 3-minute video. I thought I'd share, kind of center us all on what the day school looks like today. And the focus of this video is participation, which is one of our core values. And this idea, and participation is another, but this idea that an independent school education, like the one we offer at Lake Forest Country Day School, involves the participation and the partnership of families. We ask families to spend their time and their talent and experience to support the school. Many of you in this room are current or past trustees, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. That's what makes it work. So we'll take a minute to watch the video, and then we'll launch into the presentation. It's going to work fine.
The promise at the beginning of the year is we will know and love your child. And I thought, that's a lofty goal.
When we talk about knowing and loving your child, that doesn't just mean on an academic sense. It means we're going to understand what they do outside of school, what they do inside of school, what makes them tick.
2 months in, all of the teachers that we met with not only knew our children, but genuinely loved and understood our children. And for a parent, that is a game changer.
I really feel like they just know how to get to them in a way that I don't think that I could.
Honestly, I think over the years, the school has just ramped it up. When you walk into the school, it legitimately feels like a warm hug. Participation is a huge deal. It's really a commitment on behalf of the family that we want to make the most of our school experience. Participation is how you gain that connection to the school. It's how you gain a connection to your child's experience at the school. And it's a commitment on behalf of the school that we will know and love your child.
You know, sometimes the investment that you make is you have to stretch a little, whether it's your time, whether it's your expertise. Those are all ways in which we can amplify the impact of our school by welcoming and supporting philanthropy of all different types. Being able to achieve 100% participation with any constituent group sends a very clear signal.
It is this amazing place of purpose. It's an amazing place of community.
But it's not just letters on a wall. It happens and it works.
We're fortunate to choose a school that aligns with our values.
The more you get involved, the more you participate, the more you're going to get out of this school, and the better the school will be for.
So that helps sort of set the dialogue for today. I'm guessing many of you saw some familiar faces, some of whom are in this room today. But it just gives you a sense of, what's happening in Lake Forest Country Day School now. And I'd like that to sort of launch us into a dialogue about independent schools in general, and then we'll talk about Lake Forest Country Day School and what's happening today. And I'd like to start in what are my fundamental beliefs as an educator, because I think that's a good springboard into any dialogue around schools. And I characterize it as this paradox of childhood. And where does independent school, where do they fit into this, right? And what I mean by the paradox of childhood is, one of my fundamental beliefs is there are 4 very influential things in a student's life during their formative years, during their adolescence. And education is one of the main 4. Family is the other, faith is the third, and your health, right? If you don't have good health, then it's difficult to make the most of your experience during those critical years. So all 4 of those things come together to help us develop into the individuals that we are today as adults. However, children have almost no control over the circumstances into which they're born. They don't choose their parents. They have no control over their health. These things are just products of their existence. So how does an independent school play a role in bridging that gap or bringing those 4 different elements together in a way where a young person can become the best version of themselves? So let's talk about independent schools in terms of just statistics. So 90% of the students in America attend public schools. I attended public schools. I also attended independent schools. I've worked in public schools, but I've decided to spend most of my career in independent schools. So, and I like having that perspective as an educator. So 10% go to private schools, 90% go to public, 1% go to independent schools. So independent schools are a subset of private schools. And they are generally schools, so 1% of all the students in the US attend independent schools. Independent schools are mission driven, and there are all manner of missions out there. So if you look at the mission of Lake Forest Country Day School, inspire teaching, academic rigor, attention to individual needs, and developing responsible citizens, those are the 4 things that we focus on, right? And helping to launch students into life, well prepared in those 4 areas. So whenever we're asking ourselves a question at the board level or at the operational level, we come back to this mission and we say, is this something that's going to further the mission of our school? The other thing that we look at are our core values: excellence, partnership, participation, responsibility, and diversity, right? All of which have, a couple sentence description that goes after it, but I think you get the general idea. These core values inform all the decisions that we make. But our core values and our mission are not the same as the core values and missions of other independent schools. So they're very specific. As an independent school, we're accredited by ISACS, the Independent School Association of the Central States, and we belong to NAIS. So there's this regional accreditation, right? The accreditation doesn't occur through a government entity. It occurs through a private body. Generally, independent schools, they focus on sort of the developmental milestones that all kids experience, right? So those are paramount. However, the curricula and the methods of teaching, they're going to vary considerably based on the mission and the values of the school. So what that means is there's a wide variety of independent schools out there. There are faith-based schools, there are single-sex schools, there's schools that are focused on the environment, there's schools that are focused on athletics. Across the country, there's a great variety. But still in that very small 1%. So Gallup did a recent poll focusing on the sort of the presence of independent school students in colleges and universities. And this is actually something we were discussing at a heads conference last week, and I found it quite interesting because there is an assumption out there by a lot of people that independent schools are a place for the elite, the wealthy, and the influential, right? And it's just simply not the case. There was actually an article in the Atlantic maybe 3 years ago that sort of zeroed in on maybe specific schools that could be seen in that way. But there are, as I mentioned earlier, there are many, many different types of independent school throughout the country. And I'll give you an example. The last school that I worked in as head, it was in a rural, underserved part of Virginia. All of its graduates went to college, many of whom were first generation college students. But its operating budget, its philanthropy, its resources, its physical plant, they weren't what one would often think of as typical for an independent school. And there are many other independent schools like that out there. So how do we break that down? Well, Gallup looked at 1,300 colleges and universities, of which there are just over 2,000 in the country. And they identified 25 as highly selective. And they used the criteria of highly selective as accepting 20% or fewer of their applicants, which is it's not the only criteria, but it is a criteria that schools use. So of those 25 schools out of the 1,300 that accepted less than 20% of their applicants, a third of those students came from independent schools. Remember, that's only 1% of all the students in the country, but they make up a third of the most elite colleges across the country, right? So, but that tells us even more, at least in my opinion. And there's some assumptions that are being made here, but I think we can make the leap that in most independent schools, 20 to 30% of the students are on some form of financial support. Now, there's certain schools for whom that's a big part of their mission. And maybe it's 50 or 60% of their students are on some form of financial assistance. But in general, it's 20 to 30%. So if we make the assumption that across the country, independent schools offer 20 to 30% of their student body some form of financial support, well, then what that tells us is that 1/3 of students that occupy the most elite colleges and universities, about a third or 25% of those students come from families that are not affluent families, right? So in my mind, that makes independent schools actually an agent for social change and mobility in terms of sort of the socioeconomic strata within the country. They are accessible in ways that I think people don't always understand. And again, it gets back to this idea, and at least at Lake Forest Country Day School and all the other independent schools where I've worked, we want to bring families into the school that believe in the mission of the school and they're willing to make sacrifices to send their children. So that's sort of an undercurrent. So John Gula was one of the speakers at this last conference that I attended. He's the executive director of the E. E. Ford Foundation, former head of the Blake School in Minneapolis, and 3 other independent schools. So he's been in the business for a long time. And this is the way that he said it, and I'll read it in case the screen's a little small. It says, extraordinary external events like technological advances, globalism, climate crisis, call for rapid evolution for survival, and I believe independent schools, nimble, pedagogically creative, differentiated, conventional, and responsive, can best show us the way. The reality is they can be some of the most effective mini engines for social mobility that exists in the 21st century. And I find that statement to be true in my experience. If you think back to industrialization, or before industrialization, before we had compulsory education in a public school system in the United States, school happened a lot like it happens now in independent schools. And one of the driving reasons behind the public education system in the U.S. was to prepare a workforce for the industrialization of the country, and it moved the country forward in some amazing ways. However, there are things that independent schools can do that are more challenging for public schools to do, and that's sort of the niche. And once again, we're back to the mission of zeroing in on specific things, and this idea of being pedagogically creative, differentiated, having a specific mission and delivering on that mission gives families the opportunity to evaluate what they want for their child and make a choice. So that's kind of the space that we reside in. So that's a little bit about independent schools in general. And I should say, if you have questions along the way, just ask. I'm happy to sort of stop and expand or respond to whatever thoughts you might have.
Question.
Yes.
The private school versus the independent school. So how is a private school here?
So most parochial schools are private schools, but not independent schools. A lot of Christian schools are private schools, but not independent schools. That's the bulk,
And
really.
that's based on their mission statement and their purpose.
It's based on their accreditation.
On their
Like,
purpose.
how are you? What does your accreditation process look like? In ISEX, you go through it every 7 years. In Virginia, when I was pretty heavily involved with the accreditation committee for the Virginia Association of Independent Schools during my time there, and there it's 5 years. So it's sort of 5 to 7, depending on what state you're in. And it's a rigorous process, and it's an important process. But here's the interesting thing, and one of the things that I love about independent schools, and we could have a whole nother conversation about why I pivoted into independent schools from public school. But when you're accredited, the most important element of the accreditation process, because you have a visiting team, a head of school, and teachers and administrators from other schools across your association come into your school, and they spend several days, and they evaluate how well you do what you say you're doing. So that's the operative idea there. There's certain standards they expect you to meet. They expect your students to be able to graduate with a good education, and they expect you to have a math curriculum and a reading curriculum. But in terms of what emphasize and what you think is most important, that's up to you as a school to decide. The purpose of the accreditation team, the accreditation process, is to make sure you do what you say you're doing, and you're doing it well. It's not to tell you what to do. So that and therein lies the independence of your schools. Yes.
You've mentioned the mission quite a bit. Is that mission something you implemented since you came, or was it the previous mission?
That's a great question. Because missions shift over. Core values don't often shift, but missions can change a little bit over time. The current mission's been in place for several years, but I've been at schools where we've done mission revisions, usually as a part of a strategic plan, a strategic design process. And really the goal there is to, assuming the school is moving forward in a positive way, which Lake Forest Country Day School is, and there doesn't need to be a dramatic mission change or pivot. The goal is to stay current, to stay relevant, and sort of stay on the leading edge of what's happening in teaching and learning. So that does require, just as in business, you're going to adjust your mission periodically, but it's not something you do without a lot of thought and consideration and dialogue with your community.
Right. Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about the thing that's probably most familiar to all of us in this room, Lake Forest Country Day School. I asked a colleague of mine to develop the slide for me, but I feel silly having it up here because you all know the history. But just taking us through, founded in 1888 as Alcott School, and then also then Lake Forest Day School was founded in 1928. It moved from what I learned today, this location, correct, to Green Bay Road. And then Alcott became Bell School, and then they merged and became Lake Forest Country Day School in 1958. So that's a little bit about the history of the school that we're all connected to, which is a long and storied history for a K-8 independent school, especially in the Midwest. And you know, the Country Day component of our model is, I mentioned earlier that schools have different missions, but there is a through line there for the Country Day School model, which are essentially schools that were formed often by parents that were intended to carry kids through that K-8 experience and prepare them to go off to boarding school and then to college. And they were often founded outside of major urban areas in rural areas. A similar model is the Calvert School model, which is almost the same in all the ways I just described, but it was meant for the foreign service. So Calvert schools popped up around the world. So that's a little bit about our history. So our legacy of partnership, we were talking about this a little bit during lunch. We're thought partners in our community in ways that people don't always realize. We have a special speaker series every year, and we bring in some pretty influential and well-known speakers from year to year. Most recently, we had Leanne Young in the top left-hand corner come through in the fall. Our next visitor is Max Stossel on the far left. He's coming on February 28th in the morning at 8:30 in the PAC if you want to come listen to him. His area of expertise is kids and social media. And that is obviously a hot topic right now. I've seen videos of him, and of course I read his reviews. He's pretty dynamic. He'll also be speaking to the faculty and also be speaking to the students around this topic. But yeah, so we have a sort of a regular cycle of influential speakers coming through our area. And we've moved in the direction of partnering with other nonprofits to get them to help us communicate these opportunities. And then we've reciprocated that. Again, just another opportunity to connect with our community and amplify the message. We've also hosted last spring, we hosted a conference called Learning and Teaching in the Age of AI. We hosted it at Lake Forest Country Day School. We involved all of the local public, private, and independent schools and higher ed. Lake Forest College was present, Northwestern University was present, and there were opportunities for our teachers and teachers from all around the region to go to different sessions and learn about, at that time, it was just really sort of hitting the scene in a big way, especially in the writing department. But now we know AI is everywhere. It's in art, it's in writing, it's in many, many different spaces. So that was a great opportunity for us to be a thought leader and a thought partner in the community. And this year we're holding a similar gathering in the bottom here, April 9th, but we're focusing more on different forms of learning. How do kids learn? How is research informed what we know about how students learn today? So the call for proposals here is getting ready to go out next week, and it will go out to our whole region asking people to submit proposals to present sessions on this topic. And we'll probably have a couple of LFCDS presenters, but our goal is to get presenters from all throughout the region. So just examples of how we're a thought partner in our community. We're also a service partner. And these are just some of the organizations that we partner with, generally through student community service and faculty community service. 2 weeks from now, I'm going up to North Chicago to teach science lessons, because my background is as a science teacher, to 2-year-olds at an elementary school during their aftercare program. But I'll be there with a bunch of our 7th and 8th graders who will assist me in that process. And the teachers at the school rotate every month we go. But that's just one example. So we have a great partnership with McKinley Post 264 for our Veterans Day program. And I'm sure your pause for Patrick was in our school last week. They brought therapy dogs through. Right as the kids were sort of finishing up the semester, especially for the older kids, there's a little bit of pressure there because there's a lot of end of semester projects due. So lots of different activities going. So what's happening in LCDS today? What's trending? How do we measure ourselves internally in terms of our health? And how do we measure ourselves against other independent schools? So let's talk about internal metrics. So we're going to look at this in sort of a 5-year snapshot starting in 2019 up through today. And a lot's happened since 2019, right? But what you can see on the far left is a pattern of growing enrollment since 2019. In 2019, we opened at 374 students, and that's been going up slowly. This year, we opened at 411 students. Right now, we're at 416 because we had a few students come on board throughout the course of the year. And that's moved us into what we're calling our optimal zone of enrollment, which is right now between 390 and 420 students. And that's based on our current staffing, because that makes up, 60 to 70% of the operating budget of the school, people. And it also is, from a space perspective, at 420, we're filling all the spaces with students. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of new students. So starting in 2019, we had 77 new students, and then 94, 96, 108 in 2022, and then this year we had 98. And I think it's important to point out that this is actually a good thing for a couple of reasons. One, it means we can be more selective because we've got more interest. And two, it means there's lower attrition, right? Because, there are two ends of the admissions funnel. There are the kids that come in to the school as applicants and we accept, but there are also kids that may not stay. And that was a real concern during COVID. Independent schools across the country, their heads were spinning when COVID hit because of the financial implications. There was a concern that enrollment would drop precipitously. But what actually happened is most schools got a little bit of an enrollment bump because what we talked about earlier, independent schools are nimble and innovative, and we were able to provide better online instruction and move back into the classroom more quickly than, I'm not going to say all, but most other schools. So what happened is a lot of parents brought their kids to independent schools, but the question was, are they going to stay? And at some independent schools, they haven't. At Lake Forest Country Day School, more or less they have. So that pattern has continued outside of that. And you can see that in this next graph. On the left-hand side, you can see that our catchment of students has grown significantly over the last 5 years. We're now pulling kids from 32 zip codes across the North Shore. We have kids coming from as far as an hour away because, again, their families believe in the mission of the school and they want that for their child. Over here on the right-hand side, you can see the growth in applications. So this is a metric that we use to measure interest. The bottom light green line is an average of applications from September to December from the years 2016 to 2019. So this is sort of the pre-COVID line. What was happening in the area of applications at Lake Forest Country Day School ahead of COVID? Yeah.
So you talked about full capacity right now with the current school being at 420. In terms of all those different zip codes, I'm curious, at what point does it become too hard to manage a school in terms of children getting to school, children getting to know each other, playing sports and all that? I imagine at some point that starts to get pretty hard.
Yeah, the biggest logistical challenge there is transportation. Getting the kids to the school that are proximal to the campus. In terms of the opportunity for kids from different zip codes to be at the school and interact with kids that might live closer to the school, in my eyes, that's actually a big advantage. I think it helps to have kids from different areas that sort of represent different communities, because what that does is it creates an environment that's it is more similar to the environment that all of our students will graduate into when they go to secondary school. In terms of things like athletics, it does make it challenging because that means that a parent has to pick their child up and then bring them back or find somebody else to watch them. So there are always things to work out on that front. But having different North Shore communities represented at Lake Forest Country Day School I think it strengthens the school, and it also sort of spreads the good news, sort of proselytizes the good things that are happening at the school. And again, the Lake Forest Country Day School experience isn't for everybody, right? But there are lots of people out there that may not know about us and might want that for their child. And when we're in these other zip codes, they learn about us. Yeah,
Percentage of applicants get in.
we're going to get to that.
Oh.
Wow. Kid, you're getting ahead of me. I promise to answer that question. So pre-COVID, average, COVID, so 2020 to 2022, and then this line is last year, and then the fuchsia or pink line is this year, right? So there has been an uptick in applications through and beyond COVID. And we will continue to update this as we get into November. We're just in the beginning of new enrollment season. Today is actually our final day for re-enrollment, and then we move into new enrollment next week. So we still have a lot of new kids touring the school. So this line will continue to go up. So this is our admissions funnel, and we've broken it down in two ways. On the far left-hand side, it's an average from 2019 to 2022, so moving into and out of COVID. And on the right-hand side is our admissions funnel from last year. At the very, very top of the funnel, we have inquiry to application. So how many people that we know make an inquiry about the school actually apply? Right? So we want to convert those inquiries to applications. The average from 2019 to 2022 is 42%. The average for 2023 is 39%. What's important to consider, though, is our number of inquiries have gone up significantly. So we sort of expected that our conversion rate would go down, but we're still getting more applications because there's so many more inquiries. Okay? The next level of the tunnel is the acceptance rate. And as we talked about earlier with these elite colleges and universities, this is sort of where you want to manage your number and try and keep it low, not because well, maybe put that in an affirmative way, because you want to be accepting families where there's real evidence that they believe in the mission of the school. They're going to invest themselves and therefore be good partners, right? So our acceptance rate, the average acceptance rate was 78% during this average period, and then last year it was 63%. I suspect it will drop again this year as the applicant pool is very rich. And then finally, at the bottom of the funnel, the yield, you want that number to be high. You want all the kids that you accept into the school to accept that invitation. And our yield's gone up. The 4-year average prior to last year was 83.5, and this year it's 88%. So which is pretty good yield for a school. How am I doing on time? So I'll make sure that.
Oh, you're fine.
Good,
Another
great.
10, 15 minutes.
Okay. So those are ways that we measure our sort of health as an independent school internally, but we always have to be benchmarking ourselves against other schools like us across the nation. So we belong to this organization called Index. It's a collection of about 175 independent schools all around the country. They're about, the criteria is they have to have 400 or more students, and they have to be showing strong indices of health across all the indices we use to measure health in independent schools. So we are a member of this group. And we benchmark ourselves against this group. This is just a smattering of the benchmarking that I'll share with you today, but we're required as a product of our membership to share statistics about Lake Forest Country Day School every year, as are all the other schools in the association. So all of those go into a database that we can then access to benchmark ourselves to see how we're doing. So index schools are on the left. There are 25 index schools just like us, i.e. they're pre-K through 8 or K through 8 or K through 9 or pre-K through 9 schools. And these are the median values for last year that we're looking at. So on the far left-hand side, the median acceptance rate in index was 58%. And then the median acceptance rate at Lake Forest Country Day School is 63%. The median yield, how many of those students that you accept actually come? Across these 25 schools, the median yield was 73%, ours was 88%. So you can sort of see how we run through these. Percent students of color, we are actually the median. So we're smack dab in the middle of these 25 schools at 22%. Student to teacher ratio, the median is 7.5 to 1. We're on the better side of this. You want a low number here at 7 to 1. Percent of faculty with advanced degrees, 67 to 71. Average years of teaching experience, 17 to 18. So we're either right there or on the right side of the median of these numbers. On the sort of the finance side of schools, operating expenses for index schools is 17 million. For us, it's 14 million. This is a little bit of a hard comparison because some schools are a lot bigger than us. So this isn't really apples to apples, but I thought I'd share it anyway. But I think this is an important one. Our endowment right now is sitting at 32 million, and the median endowment for independent schools like ours across the country is 28. And there's been a lot of effort going into growing the endowment of the school. This was not the case several years ago. We'll talk about that in just a minute. The average debt in an index school is 20 million. We're at 18. As recently as a year ago, it was 23. So we've tamped that down through a lot of work by our finance committee and our board. Annual giving by parents, 2,100 compared to 2,300. Average tuition, we're the median. You know, Lake Forest Country Day School is the median tuition for these 25 schools across the country. Percent of students receiving financial aid, 20% is the median for index, 24 for us. We talked about this earlier. And finally, this is financial aid as a percent of operating budget. This is a number you want to keep. You got to manage that number, right? You can't offer more financial aid than you can afford. The median's 15 and we're at 16. So I know that's a lot of numbers I just threw at you one time, but it's sort of, I mean, it tells you a lot about where we fit in the landscape of the schools most like us across the. This shows you a comparison of enrollment against our neighbors and the national scene. So here are the index schools that we just talked about. Here are the LMAs. So LMAs is the Lake Michigan Association of Independent Schools. These are the independent schools in Chicagoland, right? And this is Lake Forest Country Day School. And this is percent change in enrollment cumulatively over years. You can see the pattern here. Generally, schools in the Chicagoland area, especially schools when you get closer to the city, have been experiencing a decline in enrollment. And index schools, these 25 schools like us across the country, there's been a little bit of a dip, and now it's starting to come up a little bit. But we're fortunate at Lake Forest Country Day School where we've been experiencing an increase over the last 5 years. This tells you a little bit about what we're doing with our money and how we make ourselves whole from a financial perspective. Again, starting in 2019 and up through this year. The gray area are expenses. The dark green areas are revenue. The independent school model is your revenue never meets your expenses. As a not-for-profit and an independent school, for all of us, there's a gap. And we fill that gap through a draw off of our endowment. So you can see the amount of that draw over time in gold. Just gives you a sense of to what degree we've drawn off our endowment. The good news here is the maximum we'll ever draw is 5% off of the 3-year quarterly rolling average. And in many years, we don't have to draw 5%. We draw below 5%. This year, we're budgeted to draw, I think, 3.5, 3.8, right? So whatever we don't draw gets reinvested and that endowment grows over time. This shows you the history of the endowment at the school, okay? You know, as recently as, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, our endowment and this gold line, which is essentially our debt, they were right on top of one another. And that debt was incurred back in around 2005, I think, when the school went through a major facilities renovation and additions, which needed to be done. The idea was this will drive enrollment. And over time, it has. We have a fantastic facility. And a few things have been happening simultaneously. There's been some really good financial management. There's been some growth of the endowment through gifts, but also through interest growth. And then which has allowed us to pay down some of this debt over time. So we're in a pattern of increasing endowment and decreasing debt, which is the place that I'm supposed to be in. So what lies ahead? Well, we're in the midst of this strategic design process, and I'll move through this pretty quickly. But really, we've gathered a group of people to help us reach out to our community and get a sense of what do we want to do next. You know, what are our hopes and dreams for the future of the school? What's our vision for Lake Forest Country Day School? This process started back in the winter of 2003 when I started looking for a consultant to assist us in the process. And it will end in the fall of 2024 when we publish our strategic plan for the future. So there are 10 people on the strategic design team. There's school leadership, there's faculty, there are trustees, there are parents, there's alums. So there's a cross section of our school community. We've reached out to over 150 people through focus groups. Some of those focus group members are in the room today to get their perspective on the school through asking them a series of questions. And most recently, we sent a survey to our school community. We've received 375 responses to that survey that asks a pretty in-depth series of questions about their LFCDS experience. The good news is, and this is, I don't mean to brag, but I'm going to brag a little bit. Maybe bragging is not the right word. I'm going to be grateful. And our consultant that we're working with really couldn't believe this. He's like, this very rarely happens. But in the leading question, is sort of an all-encompassing question of how satisfied are you with your Lake Forest Country Day School experience? And remember, this isn't just current parents. This is past parents, alums, employees, 97%. I mean, if you're hitting 85, you're doing a pretty good job. That's the general metric. So what this communicates to us in this moment in time, generally our broader school community is positive about where the school is. Now, that's a good thing to know. Now, there's several other questions that we asked, and there's some good constructive feedback that we got about areas where we might want to focus. So that, you know, this doesn't mean that there aren't things we need to zero in on and improve upon, and we will. But this is a good place to start. So summary, right? What do I want you to take away after all that? First of all, independent schools serve families that believe in the mission of the school. That's the space we live in, right? We're not all things to all people. Secondly, independent schools partner with parents and help children become the best version of themselves that they can be. That's the most we could ask for, right? Because every child is different. Therefore, the experience that they have in our school needs to be a little different as well. And we work very hard to do that. We don't always get it right, but we allocate a lot of resource, a lot of energy, and a lot of ourselves into making that happen. Third, independent schools as a whole, they're hives of innovation, they're hives of thought leadership, and they create opportunities for social mobility for kids from all across the country, from all walks of life. And the final piece that I want to share is that our school is in a position of strength and we're planning for the future. And the way that I like to characterize this, and this will be my final comment, you know, when I think about Lake Forest Country Day School, there are a lot of people that have attended the school since 1888, and many of them are in this room. There are 416 kids at the school right now that are having that experience. But most of the students haven't come to the school yet. That's my way of looking at it. My job as the head of school is to work for the future of the school. My job is to have the school relevant and well stewarded into the future so that all the students that have not yet come have an opportunity to be there. That doesn't mean that we step away from the day-to-day operations of the school. We're deeply immersed in that, but especially when we're in the strategic design process, we're thinking about the future and keeping the school healthy and strong and as a resource to them. So thank you for having me today.
Definitely feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, any
if anyone
questions
has
out
one.
there? Yes, Katie.
Thank you for all this. I think of the day school as a family school. How do you handle with increased acceptances and lower rate of acceptances?
Mhm.
A family that not every child is necessarily equal in their academic ability.
Mhm.
So you must be presented with a family that kids have some learning disability
Sure.
issues. How do you handle that within the families in the context of the school?
Yeah, you know, we handle that in several different ways. The first of which is we try and be on the leading edge of knowing what's been revealed through research about how kids learn. And the more that we as an educational community delve into that topic, we realize that, I mean, we sort of already knew that all kids don't learn the same way, but what's becoming more apparent to us is the kids that were traditionally thought to learn in ways that made them less of a higher achiever is really more about the way we're teaching and not about the way that we're learning. So we have to develop our skill as teachers to meet the needs of different learners. So that's one way that we go about doing it. Two, we want to make sure that we're accepting students into the school whose needs we can meet, right? That's hard to do when they're 3 years old because you really don't know a whole lot. So again, we don't always get that right, but when we're not getting it right, it's our responsibility to be compassionate and engaged and direct with families about what we can do to try and support their child and what we can't. And then, there's a decision that's made there about whether we can be the right school for them or not. Because really, I mean, and then, you don't find yourself in these situations often as a head of school, but they happen. I've had a handful in my career, and it's really hard to sit down with a family and essentially counsel a student out of your school. But the way that I think about it often, and it helps, doesn't always help, but are we really doing that child a service if there's a better place for them to be that can help them become the best version of themselves? Should we really keep them in our school when there's another setting that will help them sort of optimize their experience? And then the other way we do it is we invest in our learning support. We have a robust and highly talented group of individuals in our school that provide support to students that may learn in different ways. So that's sort of how we maintain that balance. Yeah, other question.
John, that slide about the change in percentage enrollment since 2019 is fascinating. I would have thought that all different schools were in a similar position as Lakewood country away. So props to you and everyone with you guys, something to do with that. It's remarkable. I'm surprised that there's local independent schools here that are struggling.
Yeah, it's there are a couple of things that I mean, we're fortunate in that we have an amazingly committed faculty and a strong program and a desire to always get better, right? So that's number one. But there are some other things that are working in our favor, right? There are families that are moving in this direction, and that sort of gets to the idea of being present in different zip codes. We want their first contact with school options to be LSCDS, right? So they don't learn about something else or some other school they think might be the right fit for their child, make that commitment and never learn about us. And here's the other thing I meant to mention in sort of the community and partnership portion. Having LSCDS in this community makes us a stronger community. Right? Because as a parent, I am a parent, so if I'm moving to a new community, what's one of the first things that I'm going to evaluate? Schools, right? So we're fortunate in this space because we have good public schools and we have a great independent school option, a handful of great independent school options, and other private schools. So sometimes people adopt this mindset of it's us against them. It's really not, in my mind. We offer something different. And in my opinion, it's the space where I want to spend my career because it's what I believe in. I think we do amazing things with kids. And it's okay if other people don't feel the same way. There are enough students out there and enough families that believe in the mission of our school to keep our school fully enrolled and healthy. The trick is that they're aware of us. Because 82%, 83% of independent school, like students that come to us, they come because of word of mouth. I mean, yes, we have print advertising, we have a pretty sophisticated digital marketing platform that we work from. But when you ask families, they heard from a friend. So, spreading that news and encouraging families to come take a look. And then once they come and they tour and their child spends a day, which by the way, a lot of independent schools don't do. They don't allow kids to shadow during the day, especially the really competitive ones. Go figure. And in my mind, it's a no-brainer. I'm like, well, why would I send my child to a school where they can't spend the day with the student budget? So that being an integral component, just like the library and all of the wonderful resources we have in this community are important critical elements of the whole town. The school is as well.
John, are you seeing a similar percentage in the increase in applications for job openings? that you are for admissions? What is that side of things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we have not rolled into our hiring season for next year. We were very fortunate last year, and then so we have about 92 full-time employees, about 62, 63 of which are faculty, depending on whether they're full-time or part-time. Last year, we replaced 3 people, right, which is pretty unheard of in independent schools. This year, I think it's going to be more than 3. You know, we have some people retiring. I don't want to mention any names, but you know, it's going to be north of 3, but south of 10.
Are they still on
So-
a yearly contract, your teachers?
Yeah, all employees are on a yearly contract. Yeah. But the search we're in right now is a search for our next lower school head, right? Because that position is splitting for next year, and we'll have a new lower school head, and Sarah Walsh will continue as the head of ECC. And then the year after that, she's going to retire, and we'll be hiring into that role. We have a very strong applicant pool. What I would consider, in my experience as an independent school educator, a very strong applicant pool for that position. And we're still in the sort of the closed portion of the search, but that will open up very soon when we start inviting finalists to points. So you'll all have an opportunity to meet what will likely be 3 finalists when they come through. Yes.
Average starting salary for an independent school teacher. I have no concept now compared to.
Yeah.
You know, our public school, District 67. I mean, is it higher, lower?
Yeah, yeah, that's a great question because it really drives our operating budget.
Yeah.
2, because it's the thing we have to benchmark ourselves against with the public schools and the private schools. And 3, it's the area where we most want to be able to grow in our capacity, right? So what I can give you is the median value, which is probably a better way of looking at it. But our median faculty compensation is about $72,000 a year. For NAIS, which are all of the independent schools across the country, which is a very large number of schools. It's not the index number I was talking to you about before. It's all independent schools. It's about $68,000 or $69,000 a year. For the public school system, it really depends on which system you're in. But I would ballpark it. It generally tracks about 10% to 15% above where we were. So, I mean, we're in the ballpark, but we're not. I mean, we're just, you know, the interesting thing about independent schools is, you know, the financial model of the public school system is just so different, right? It's determined essentially by property taxes, right? With a little bit of money from the state and a little bit of money from the federal government. But it's really about, and this gets, no, I don't mean to get on a tangent here, but it gets back to this idea that independent schools are elitist and exclusive. Well, they're what we call it, they're super zip codes. And Lake Forest is probably one of them, where you have a pretty affluent community and really well-funded public schools. But that might look very different in another part of the country. So this idea that a public education in the US is the same in one place as it is in another is just, there's as much variability in schools and public schools as there are in private schools in a lot of ways. I just think that the difference is that, you know, we determine our own path in terms of our program. And in public schools, it's determined by the state. And it varies, and people don't often think that it varies from state to state, but it does. You know, what you learn in an English class or a history class in one state might be different than what you learn in an English or history class in another state.
All right, well, thank you, John.
All right, thanks.
If someone wants to come up and ask John more questions, feel free. Thank you, that was great. Really, really appreciate it.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, John.